This final discussion is about our contemporary brave new world of digital archives, where most of our new films live. Certainly our personal family collections, everything documented about my 5-year-old son exists on digital space. And we have collected a group of people who approach this from different perspectives to talk about this. And over the course of this next hour and 10 minutes, we invite you to contribute from the audience. Katie Traynor from MoMA's Film Archives, broke it down simply from her perspective. Digital archives, you want to have them in a couple different hard drives, and you want to be constantly migrating them and checking in on them every once in a while, a lot more frequently than you used to need to if you had a roll of film and had it in cold storage. So the people we have on this panel to discuss it from different perspectives, I'm going to start at the very end. Allison Berg is a filmmaker. Her latest film was The Dog, about the real-life story behind Dog Day Afternoon that she made with Frank Caroudran. Allison was also one of the principal organizers of IDA's Getting Real conference in September, and has had lots of opportunities to talk to other filmmakers around this subject. The Dog was a 10-year project, and so over the course of those 10 years, she had a lot of time to worry about the footage she was sitting on and think about how to handle it. And just now that I'm mentioning the Getting Real conference, it reminds me, if I don't think to say it later, if anyone here isn't already on the IDA mailing list or the Doc NYC mailing list, I encourage you to sign up for both. It's a way of staying up to date with future events like this, and also getting discounts to events like this. So make sure you sign up for IDA and Doc NYC's mailing list. Next to Allison is Rufus de Rham, who works at Lincoln Center as his day job. He is a graduate of NYU's MEAP program, their Moving Image Archive program. Is that what the P is for?
Preservation.
Preservation. Moving Image Archive Preservation?
Moving Image Archiving and Preservation.
Gotcha.
Program.
So
MEAP.
The head of that program, Dan Streeple, is someone who's been on this stage before at Stranger Than Fiction. He's the founder of the Orphan Film Symposium. We've done some events with Dan, and he is one of the most knowledgeable people in the field that I know. And when I called Dan up for some suggestions, he referred me to Rufus, and Rufus is also involved with the archival activists. Is that
the activist archivists?
Activist
yes.
Archivist.
ACTARCs for short.
Project, which I'll have him talk more about. Clara Fon-Sing in the middle. If any of you have come to our Doc NYC Docathon panels on archive material and stock footage, you may have seen Clara talk before. She works for NBC Universal Archives, so a kind of contrast to those of us who are worried about our personal archives. She is connected to a giant corporate set of archives that brings its own set of challenges. And Clara would be the first to say that she's not the technical person who's tasked with these challenges, but is the person who has to be out in the world representing the collection. She can share some insights for us about the things that a big corporate collection has to think about in this age. And then next to me is David Leitner, who wears many hats as a filmmaker, as a thinker about film, a writer about film for Filmmaker magazine and lots of other places. And David also has a long background thinking about archival issues, and he can talk a little bit more about that. So Allison, let me start with you. As a filmmaker, you're probably closest to the experience of many people in this room. You're making this project the dog for over 10 years, drawing upon archival footage, dealing with the footage you had shot yourself, and over the process of 10 years, went through probably several different formats. I remember at the beginning of the project, you had borrowed my mini DV camera to shoot some material. Talk to us about the quandaries you faced as a filmmaker and being your own archivist, and how you met those challenges.
Sure. I might backtrack a little bit because I learned a valuable lesson with my first film, which is an Exile. And in 2001, this will sound very familiar, I'm sure, to other filmmakers. You think you're really organized, and we had our edit room, and I kept all the masters really organized on a bookshelf in a separate location, my apartment. And this was, 14 years ago, and so we were editing on an Avid low res, and one night I was evacuated from my building because of a fire, and I stood across the street and watched as they basically just, hosed down my next door neighbor's apartment, wondering if they were going to do the same to mine, and all my tapes were in there. And this was a film I shot in Ghana, and if that had happened, there was no getting it back. I think that's something that, with documentary, we have to remember that most of what we're filming, we can't redo. That we're not doing these shoots over again. So it's priceless material. And the other thing, and this goes for both my films and probably many here, is it always takes a lot longer than we expect. And so we have to think a little bit differently about how we take care of our material as we're in the process of making the film. And I think because so many of us either work on our own or with really small, staff, we get overwhelmed and things fall through the cracks. And so I think we just have to prioritize all of this a lot more than we do. And it's not really until you have a close call that you start doing things a little bit differently. So with that being said, a year later, we started The Dog, 2002, working on PD-150. And we got a fireproof safe, which we put in my apartment. And then we got a waterproof safe, and we got a commercial storage facility. And we were great about having clones of our masters and keeping one set in one place and one set in the other. But as the years go by, you start shooting more and more. Not everything fits into the fireproof safe. You get not only the archival material from organizations like the NBC archives, but you also start getting really incredible one-of-a-kind material that you end up rescuing yourself. We had a number of pieces of 1 inch and 3/4 that we had to go about and actually restore ourselves at a place called Speck Brothers in Lodi. We had all this material. It all started being kept in the commercial storage facility. It was temperature controlled. It seemed like a great place. We had plastic tubs. We had the waterproof safe. Not everything could fit back in my apartment, but we thought we were doing a pretty good job of it. And yes, we were taking the mini DV. We were, transferring everything onto, like our DV cam tapes. We're trying to make everything the same, upgrading a few years every so often. Everything took many, many more years than we expected, and then Hurricane Sandy happened. And I was really worried about where we were cutting the film because it was floor-to-ceiling windows right on the water in Dumbo. I thought, what could happen with the winds? What never occurred to me is that our storage facility would be flooded on 23rd Street between 10th and 11th, and we were in a basement unit. And we were flooded, and we couldn't get in for 5 days. And those were 5 of the longest days I've ever had because we'd already been working on the film for 9 years. And there was stuff in there that was not at my apartment, and there was no going back. And when we got in there, we were very lucky. There were things that were ruined, but everything that we had that were, our tapes and our reels were in plastic tubs. They were in the waterproof safe. And so we were lucky. But we also really wanted to finish the film as soon as we could after that. But I guess I come at this from, even though those were mostly tapes, it doesn't matter if it's tapes or drives. How organized are you? What kind of system do you have? And all through this process of making this last film, because it took so long, when we would take material out of storage, we would keep it like we were checking something out of a library. You need to keep track of where your material is. It's so easy to lose track of all of these different things, and especially when you're working on an archival film. And so I think we just started treating it like precious material. And so that's sort
Which
of—
it was.
Yeah, which it was.
Rufus, can you talk about your work with activist archivists? And I think also in your background is working for Democracy Now! And on their archives, am I right?
Yeah, so activist archivists started when Occupy Wall Street started, and there was a group of us at NYU and other library schools around the tri-state area that recognized the immediate importance of what was going on, and also the overwhelming amount of digital material that was being created by the activists that were on the street. So we decided that we were going to form a group that would go in to help the working groups on the ground come up with, we said, the panel's called Best Practices. We came up with Good Enough Practices. And we worked a lot with groups that have already been doing this for years, like Witness, who train human rights activists all over the world, best practices, standard practices, in an easy to understand language, because archivists and filmmakers do not speak the same language most of the time. Archivists are very technical. We deal with metadata. We deal with, complex archival collection theories and systems, and filmmakers are concerned with what did we shoot, what can I use, what's our next project. Of course, this is being extremely reductive of both groups, but so we went in and
Sounds
just
pretty accurate to me.
and we immediately realized when we started bringing up, everybody needs metadata standards, and here's your best practices for everybody should be shooting on uncompressed digital and storing on 5 different hard drives. Well, for most activists that were working there, that didn't work. That was never going to work. So we came up with hey, when you're shooting on your cell phone, aim it on your street sign so we at least know where you are. I mean, verbalize hey, this is, October 13th, blah, blah, blah. So at least we can identify at some point, what date this was. Keep a self-addressed stamped envelope so you can put your SIM card or your not your SIM card, your flash card in the envelope into a thing, so if the police stop you, they can't get your footage. It's already in the mail, they're not allowed to go in there. It's now being sent off, it's safe. Things like that, things that archivists generally don't think about. And then I also, I did work, I was the interim archivist for Democracy Now!, which, as many of you may know, is a cable or a television and internet news channel. And I was talking a little bit earlier in the audience about how, ratios, when you're shooting on film, I was talking to Whit, actually. When you're shooting on film, Whit was saying 30 to 1 on film is sort of extravagant. Well, for Democracy Now!, you go out and shoot for 7 hours for a 30-minute, at most, segment. And I was responsible for ingesting and saving all of this and naming. So that's sort of my background, I guess, in a nutshell.
And so can you share with us for a big collection like Democracy Now! Or other groups like that you've studied? What are they doing? Those of us in the audience, we maybe have a few hundred hours from our own films. So for organizations that are dealing with tens of thousands of hours of digital footage, what are they doing?
The best they can. I mean, this basically what my advice is at this point is you do the best you can with what you have. There are best practice standards. I mean, for a large corporation, for a large cultural institution, that we can all say these are indeed the best practice. Saving it on film, putting your film as an output on film to put on a shelf in climate-controlled storage. That is the best practice. Yes, that is wholly unrealistic for most people that I've dealt with. So your best practices tend to slide down to my number one thing that everybody in this room, if I have one thing to say to all filmmakers in this room, naming conventions. naming conventions. I also
Don't even know what the hell you're talking about.
So, how many of you have shot stuff and labeled things tape 1, tape 2, tape 3, tape 4, thinking, oh, I totally know what this is, and then 10 years later, you're like, oh, what the hell is this? With no idea. No, this is like the number one, and with digital, it's even more important. I mean, you like cards, you save a card, and it comes up like CF1382 underscore like whatever. Not, you know, it's machine readable, but we don't know, like, you know, renaming your files to a standard that you can follow and that is documented.
Because, so the idea being that, you know, you as an archivist are going to maybe inherit this material one day, and you're looking at 500 hours of those kinds of things. It's
absolutely. And for example, for Democracy Now!, what I would do was anytime I would ingest, there's very simple, I think it's free, it's called Name Changer for Mac, and you can aim it and say, okay, change all of these file names to this standard, and it even is sequential. So, you know, it will list through and say like, I don't know, for the dog, for example, you could say like the dog day 1, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like, or whatever you wanted to name it as. And then that would, you know, make it easier so I could then give it to an intern or whatever to later on catalog it in more detail. Because you're talking, in archivist terms, you're always thinking man hours. You're always thinking, how many man hours do I have for this collection? I mean, Katie, I think, brought up earlier that, like, or Elena was talking about her search for the AB rolls. Yeah, I've been to Culpeper. I've seen Rick's palettes of film and thought, wow, there's a lot of material in this. It's going to take years and years and years until we know what it is. But just the simple act of naming something that is human readable and sticking to that standard helps immensely going forward. Also for organization.
Yeah, I was going to say, similar to Democracy Now!, I do a lot of TV work for my jobs. And some of those shows, we have 3 to 5 cameras up, and we're shooting verite all day long. Tons of material that's being downloaded every day. And it really helps to figure out a system once you work that way, because you have all of this material you need to keep track of. So we were coming up with, you know, you have your A, B, C, D, and ECAM. You go by date, by the camera, by the number of the card. I mean, you have to get that system down, and it carries over into my documentary life that I'm so much better organized because, you know, when you work by yourself, you tend to do less, and that you just don't respect your material as much. And you know, this is where coming up with that system and sticking to it, and if you bring anybody else on, they follow that system, you have it in writing, you have your logs, that's what you have to do, especially with cards. I don't know how many people here have thought they downloaded a file and it turned out to be corrupt. They maybe just copied it from one drive to another instead of, you know, doing it directly or doing something like running it through a program to make sure everything's verified first. Everything I've worked on, there's been like one great thing that goes missing.
I also just one quick second. Logs are also extremely important. Even if it's as simple as a plain text, you know, you open up your like notepad on your computer. If you're logging and you're saving into a folder, just write like, I did this on this day, and this is what this footage is. At the very least, then you can look back and say, oh, that's what this folder is, instead of like, oh, it's folder 1 from 2002. You know, like I shot, there's 10 hours of footage in here and now I have no idea what it is.
So, Clara, let me ask you about the NBC Universal Archives. Your job is representing this archives. You know, you interact with filmmakers and help explain to them what's in your archives to license. I think you licensed material for The Dog, amongst many other films. So, you know, these questions over digital storage, how do they intersect your world?
Well, first we have to realize the scope of an archive like NBC News, and not just in terms of what's coming in on a daily basis, 24/7, all the feeds coming in, the field material and so on, and then also this legacy archives of 70 years. And so we do have to be selective. Our archiving strategy is selective on a daily basis. It's based on editorial and also on historical value. And legally we are only required to keep aired shows for 3 years for compliance reasons, but the value of an archive like ours is a lot more than that, and we keep not just the aired shows, but mostly the outtakes, the field material, and all the background footage that gets shot and mostly never used. And this is the type of content that documentary makers like yourself are most interested in. So we have this massive amount of content that nowadays it all comes in digitally, so that's simpler. And we also need to, for the legacy archive, we've been going through a digitization process, and mostly to make the access easier for relicensing it, or even for the newsroom to be able to access it. And so the question is always this balance into how much do you digitize, and what do you digitize? And we will never, for cost reason, be able to digitize everything. So we selectively go through the most requested topics, and then we went decades by decades looking at all the big topics, the anniversaries, and we also went and digitized all the nightly news, all the Today shows. So we do it in chunks. And then
Say, so there's like earlier stuff of NBC News exists on film or maybe on different videotape formats, and so you're in a process, probably never-ending process, of migrating that stuff to digital.
Exactly. So, but we do remain for a large part an analog archive. We have a film and tape warehouse in North Bergen that we access on a daily basis. And the question is always, even for a large corporation, I mean, how much do you archive? We select, but we archive a lot of material. We archive about 10 years of content every year. And then the second question is, how much of the legacy archive do you digitize? And it's always this balance of, most people request the same thing over and over again, but the value of an archive like ours is this content that no one has requested and that you do want access to. And then we do that on demand and go to the warehouse and get it on tape. And the rest is all digitized, and the small portion of it is digitized. And going forward, it will be digitized.
Thank you. So David, in thinking about this subject, you prepared some notes. You've gone through many different eras, from film to videotape, and you're an experienced camera person who's worked on multiple formats. Share with us your perspective.
Oh boy. I woke up this morning recovering from a cold, but also with my head swimming, because this topic of film preservation has been a passion of mine for decades, literally decades, which I'm going to explain to you. And Sandra Schulberg emailed me the other day and said, well, have you prepared notes? And I don't know if I wrote you back about this, but I never prepare notes. Everyone knows that I speak extemporaneously and from the hip. I woke up this morning, spinning head, and I decided that Sandra, as is often the case, was right. And so all morning long, I typed out these notes. Hopefully, we'll end up someplace interesting. At the end, I'm going to share what my personal methods are for preserving my work at the moment. And by the way, I endorse everything everyone on this panel said. This is all like, first-rate advice, everything. The call to stay organized, that's profound, and that's elemental. You have to do that from the outset. There are many complicated issues here, and as I said, the progress hangs on many fine details. Believe me, because at home, the shelves in my bedroom are full of almost every type of 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter film, analog video, and digital motion picture file formats, which are not the same as digital video, that have existed for the past 30 years. All the analog stuff, the film and the analog videos, waiting to be digitized, backed up, and archived. And this has been a personal project hanging over me for a number of years. So I want to start out with a couple of anecdotes really quickly. Last night when I was going home, I was here at the opening session. I was on the Lower East Side waiting in the cold drizzle for a bus. So I decided to call my 18-year-old nephew in Nashville. And he said, what are you doing? I said, I was at a conference. That's why I'm calling so late. And he said, what's the conference about? I said, well, it's about film. dead silence. And I said, you know, the orange stuff that, you know, comes out of the camera once you develop it, and it's got a picture on it, dead silence. I said, Kodak, dead silence. He told me he'd only ever shot digital. He didn't know what film was. And he's about to start pre-med, so he's not a dummy. Now, this is just to underscore the urgency of what we're trying to do here. Here's another example. A couple of years ago, I wanted to use some clips that I had shot in Berlin when the wall was being taken down. I was there in February of 1990, and when the Berliners themselves started knocking chunks out of the wall. In fact, Sandra's in some of the footage. A young Rick Linklater is in some of the footage. Just a bunch of us were there with hammers. And I shot it in Beta ED. Now, Beta ED extended definition was a format that Sony put out to compete with SVHS. I was shocked, this was maybe 2 years ago, to discover that there were no Beta ED decks anywhere, not even on eBay, not even inside of Sony. Fortunately, I'd had the foresight to preserve that material way back when on an archival medium called Beta SP. So anyway, I do have the images. I don't have the original images. Again, urgency. My background, the many hats that Thom alluded to, I'll explain because it's pertinent to what I'm about to say. I was a technical director at DuArt from the late 70s to the mid-80s. I created their optical printing department, which was famous for blow-ups from 16 millimeter and Super 16 to 35, but also for restoring old film, especially scratched and shrunken film. I even copied nitrate a few times, not necessarily legally, but I did it. While there, I also designed and redesigned liquid gates and optical paths for optical printers, usually to enhance the light output, to get a better result and a faster result if we could. At DuArt, we also imported the first telecine liquid gate into the US, and that was from Geierwerk Labs in Berlin. So I've been involved with this subject of actually handling film and preserving and restoring film for a very long time. Subsequent to DuArt, I spent a year. In fact, when I left DuArt in '85, a year later, I was in Houston, Texas, producing a documentary called For All Mankind. Now, I'll tell you about that a little bit because, again, it's pertinent to this discussion. Unlike the Soviets, who only ever shot 35 millimeter in space, and it's true, they took giant cameras up in those in their Soyuzes. The Apollo program generated millions of feet of 16 millimeter ectochrome, most of it ectochrome. And most of that resides at the Johnson Space Center near Houston, Texas. Now, to tell our story, which was about what it felt like emotionally as human beings to go to another planet and come back, we needed the best possible versions of what the astronauts shot in 16 millimeter. Now, we as U.S. citizens own NASA's footage, but that doesn't mean we can take it off the base or have access to the original. So to make the footage available to like the makers of like Tang commercials, I mean, you've seen some of these shots 1,000 times. NASA had the bright idea to farm out the film to a local Houston lab, which made internegatives. They did things like printed through the base, which meant that in effect, the image was defocused. And this is the footage you've seen for years. You don't know it. I wasn't going to stand for that. And I went down there and made a case for me moving on to the base, which they eventually allowed me to do. And that had to do with a space shuttle blowing up, and they were depressed, and they didn't care, and they wanted to get rid of me. So they let me stay there. They thought it was going to be 9 weeks. It turned into a year. Anyway, I rebuilt an optical printer. I redesigned the optics. I blew up 16 millimeter to 35 internegative, which I FedExed to DuArt for special pull processing. I wouldn't have trusted the mail for this, and I'm not sure I would now, but that's another story. And they probably, if you're ever going to, you're putting flashcards in the mail, but if you ever put film in the mail, I think they x-ray it. Anyway, that makes me the only non-NASA personnel ever to handle the original Ectochrome moon footage. Now, in the process, and by the way, part of the deal was that I would train one of their people to run the optical printer. Well, until he scratched footage, quite a bit of it. And I was teaching a class in the film school in Cuba, and I had to fly back and forth between Havana and Houston. I haven't told the story in years, and do the work myself because I didn't trust the NASA guy, and I made him promise not to tell anyone I was doing the work. So there's more of a story to this than's really ever come out. Anyway, in the process, I had to teach myself to create a relational database to keep track of 6 million feet of film, including the 500 shots that we eventually used in the film itself. It was done on an early Mac database software program called Double Helix out of the University of Chicago. And I think Dan Wiseman, who's sitting over there, loaned me the copy of Double Helix. Dan also visited me down at the Johnson Space Center back in those days. The happy ending is that we won both the Audience Award and Grand Jury Award at Sundance, and we were nominated for an Oscar. Brian Eno did our soundtrack, which I'm still proud about, and it gets used all the time. Danny Boyle's used it in 2 films. It's called Apollo Atmospheres. It's one of his best CDs. Now, all told, since 1987, as a director or as a producer, including For All Mankind, I've premiered 7 films at Sundance, and 8 if you include Trembling Before God, which I was the DP of. Most of them were done in film, 35 millimeter or 16 millimeter. So I'm all too aware of all of these issues. I was also briefly 644 DP, that's union. It's now a different number, but I was a union DP. So I know film inside out. It's in my blood. I wrote Kodak's book on telecine transfer of 16 millimeter. I wrote the book. So believe me, I'm a lover of film. I'm setting you up for what I'm about to say. I'm also the motion picture chair of SMPTE New York. That's the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. So I'm in a unique position of both needing a solution to these problems we've been discussing and having unusual access to industry players on the technical side and on the manufacturing side. As a result, for the past decade, again, as a dyed-in-the-wool indie filmmaker, the archiving of indie work has grown into a pet passion of mine. As Sandra and some others know, behind the scenes, I've tried to talk to several well-known local facilities into creating a low-cost, high-quality film scanning service specifically geared to the needs and to the resources of independent filmmakers. All of those films that we transferred on Ranks and Telecines in the 80s, for instance, need to be scanned into today's digital formats. Not only that, the scanners, we've made big improvements since the 1980s. I totally failed. I failed to talk anyone into this. I thought I even had a solid business case. It didn't work. No one listened. I had a little bit more luck in a different direction. I had something to do with a Kinetta film scanner being set up in New York a few years ago on a provisional basis. DeWitt Davis, who's over there, got talked into operating it. If you want to speak to him after this panel, I'm sure he'd be willing to share his experiences. I even tried to talk SMPTE into doing sessions and presentations on this issue. But I came to realize that in the digital video equipment industry, such as it is, and the broadcasting industry that it mostly exists to serve, they know nothing about the work we create. They know nothing about our needs. They really don't. They just give you blank stares when you talk to them. Nevertheless, every April, I trek out to NAB in Las Vegas on my own dime, and I make it a special point to survey the latest developments in film scanners, compression file formats, film, and also wrappers for those formats, archive management software, like Tolus Brew, if you know what that is, or Storage DNA, also evolving storage mediums. For instance, I met with Hewlett-Packard last year at NAB, and I asked them, why don't they offer user-friendly consumer Thunderbolt or USB 3 connections on their LTO6 linear tape storage drives? Because a lot of us know what LTO is. And if we don't, I'll say something more about that in a moment. HP, like other LTO manufacturers, they use something that's kind of arcane called SAS. It's a SCSI connector. It's expensive. And I said, well, why don't you put a Thunderbolt connector on this thing, or why don't you put USB 3? I had to point out to them that Thunderbolt is faster than SAS, and it's faster than Fiber Channel. There's a disconnect between their world and our world. 2 years ago, I borrowed an early Sony optical disc archive system from Sony. It wasn't out yet. And I installed it at the Checkerboard Film Foundation here in New York. I shoot a lot of Checkerboard's films on art and architecture. And I use Checkerboard as kind of a test bed for new technology. And Checkerboard allows me to do this, sometimes to their chagrin, but anyway. And I consider them a prototypical small production company. So any problem they have, you have, and I have. You preserve everything I shoot these days, and I mean everything. If I'm shooting your film, I've preserved your files, and you don't necessarily know it. Now, there's a whole moral issue there. We don't need to get into that. But I can't tell you how many times people have come back to me and said, oh, God, we can't find something, or something got corrupted, and I have it. And I not only have it backed up. So I almost think there's a moral imperative.
For a price.
No, you don't get paid for doing this, nor do you get paid for color correcting as a DP these days. Or grading. That's a whole other issue. And I grade all my own dailies, and that's, again, a whole other issue. Because the formats have changed. But we're shooting RAW. We're shooting, with various log gammas that require that kind of grading. And so there's a lot to clone, and there's a lot to back up. The files, especially with 4K, are growing exponentially larger, meaning we need exponentially more hard drive space. Now, what do I do? All right, so I brought a hard drive. Some of you may not recognize this as the hard drive. Let me show you what it is. The hard drive's inside of the case. This is the hard drive. See, it's just a bare drive, B-A-R-E, a bare drive, like naked. And I don't buy hard drives in cases. It goes into this plastic case. Then this goes onto my bookshelf, and it has a label on the back of it. And I have a labeling system, and I have a system to keep track of these. Now, there are 2 of these that I make for every project. I have probably 30 of these on my bookshelf. They're either 2 terabyte or 4 terabyte. They're usually Seagate Barracudas, but I'm not, anything. You don't have to buy Seagate. They're all pretty. Go on. Don't believe what you read on the internet. Most of the hard drives are fairly reliable these days. People have very strong preferences for Seagate versus a competitor. The 2 terabytes are about $80. The 4 terabytes are about $140. It's a heck of a lot cheaper than going out and buying a hard drive that has a power supply and a little fancy aluminum, housing that you plug into the wall from G-Tech or whatever. You'll go broke buying those. Too many of those. The little case that I just showed you is called DriveBox. Several companies make something similar. I use a dual bay Thunderbolt storage dock. It looks like, I call it a toaster because it looks like a toaster. And I just drop this drive in the top of it, in a slot in the top. Because there are 2 slots, I drop 2 drives. One's the master, one's the backup. Now, how do I record files onto them simultaneously? That would be kind of nifty, but I haven't figured that out yet. So what I do is I have one as a master drive, and then I use Carbon Copy Cloner, and that indicates that I'm a Mac person. I use Carbon Copy Cloner. It's been around for years. It copies one drive to another drive precisely, down to the bit. And it's very, very reliable, and it's not expensive. I use another program. Now, if I've got 30 or 40 of these drives up on my shelves, how the heck do I know what's in them? How do I keep track of them? Well, I use an old program that's still around, that's still being sold, called Disk Catalog Maker. And what it does is it creates it looks like a finder window of what the contents are in every drive. There are the little triangles on the left. You can click them, and the file folder drops down, and you can see what's inside. You're not actually opening those drives up, going and getting them off the shelf, putting them in the dock. You're just looking at a file format on it, whereas a hard drive can have anything in the world. It's just a bit bucket. You're just dropping bits in it. So no, I can take the content of these drives and put them into next millennium's or next decade's whatever bit bucket they come up with. So that's not true. In fact, I would argue that if you can preserve your digital files, not necessarily whether it's a ProRes file or any type of comment, but if you can preserve them, and if it's a file format that's in wide enough use, meaning that we'll have the ability to read that file format back in 10 or 15 or 20 years, you're likely to have to permanently have protected and preserved your material. Hold on. Linear tape, which is usually called LTO, linear tape open. It's used widely in the industry. It's how American Express, it's how all the bank companies save all their financial data, meaning it's got such a widespread user base, it isn't going anywhere, meaning that it's going to be developed pretty quickly, bigger and bigger capacities. Now, the problem with LTO is that it's magnetic tape. It's not a truly archival medium. The data migration is recommended every 6 to 7 years, so you don't have to do it, as often as a hard drive, let's say, but you still have to do it. It's not an archival medium. LTO tape cartridges, compared to hard drives, however, are inexpensive, and they bring significant advantages. There are no drive motors in an LTO tape. There's no platter spindle. There's no read heads that are guaranteed to fail, to crash someday. And LTO tapes are now friendlier because of something called LTFS. That stands for Linear Tape File System. It's a file system that was created by the industry a few years ago, and it allows you to hook up an LTO tape to your computer, and it looks just like a hard drive. The contents look like a hard drive. So you can create folders, you can drag and drop, and all the stuff that you're used to doing. So that's good. That means that LTO tape drives are really easy to use now. Now, the sticking point for me and why I haven't switched over to LTO tapes is capacity. It's claimed that the current generation, which is LTO6, can store 6.25 terabytes per cartridge. Well, that sounds pretty good, except that it's not true. It's based on the fact, based on a 2.5 to 1 compression that isn't appropriate to video files. Video files are already highly compressed. The native capacity of LTO6, its true capacity for storing video, digital video, is only 2.5 terabytes, and that doesn't cut it for me. Now, maybe this year, it's been promised that LTO7 will arrive, and its native capacity is supposed to be 6.4 terabytes. And I keep hedging when I describe this because I don't know if it will show up, and I don't know if it'll be 6.4 terabytes, but that's what their roadmap shows. There's an LTO organization that publicizes this stuff. I'm hoping that LTO7 will be accompanied by more friendlier tape drives that have Thunderbolt or USB 3 connections. Which brings us lastly to optical. I mentioned that Sony optical disc system, and I think I mentioned that it has a 50-year shelf life, the optical discs. It's really cool. I mean, there's no mechanism. It's 50 years. But what is it actually? It's a cartridge. And inside the cartridge, there are 12 discs. And they're basically Blu-ray discs. It draws a lot upon Sony's XD Cam technology, which has proven very, it's worked very well in camcorders. But and also in archival situations. But again, the problem is capacity. You were mentioning water. These things are water resistant. They're dust resistant. They're heat resistant. Sounds perfect, which is why I've been following them for years. But at NAB last year, about a year ago, the largest capacity was 1.5 terabytes. That just doesn't cut it for me. There's a new generation due next year, which is going to store a whopping 3.6 terabytes. Future generation, way in the future, will store 6 terabytes. It's just not enough. So I've been the biggest proponent of optical forever, but I'm throwing down the towel because I need to save my stuff, preserve it, get it into a format that I feel comfortable with, and I just don't think it's going to be optical. There are a few rays of hope. Last year at NAB, a company called M-Logic introduced an LTO6 drive with Thunderbolt, about $3,500, which is about a third what they used to cost. I'm hoping this year there'll be a lot more of them. Last fall, the SMPTE published a new standard going back to, you know about this, it's metadata stuff. It's called the Archive Exchange Format, AXF, and it's a file wrapper for archival elements. Video files, for instance. And the whole idea is to create a file wrapper that will be universal, that anybody's archival system can take in and will recognize it as an archival file, and they'll be know how to identify what's in it, et cetera, et cetera. Now, SMPTE, which is a standards organization, they create standards like SMPTE timecode, for instance. They may or may not succeed with this. They probably will preserve film like nobody's business. You'll forgive me if I say film is antique. I don't think necessarily. What I love about film is not the acetate. I don't love the polyester. I don't love the perforations. I don't love the plasticizers that evaporate from it. I don't like the emulsion that gets scratched. I don't like the lubricants that you have to put onto it. I don't like the projector mechanisms which get loose and fail and put bad registration on the screen. I love the images and I love the art, and I want to preserve the art and the images, and that's all I care about. Not a fetishist for the actual physical medium. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Rufus is as a master's degree NYU master's degree holder in this field. I wonder if things that David is talking about here. What registers with you, or do you have any different takes on this?
Where to start? No, I think a lot of this is very, this is correct. I mean, I am also no great fetishist for film. Actually, one of the reasons I chose MeUp program over the other archival programs was its focus on video formats and digital rather than film, which is something I saw as like, okay, there's X amount of film preservation jobs in this country, and they're all filled, and they will be filled until those people die. and I want a job, so I'm going to study video, and which I think we talked a little bit about video artists. I mean, I've worked with a lot of video artists, but yeah, I mean, I agree with this. I mean, I think this is an example of self-education, as Katie said. Like, you have to become your own archivist, and that's totally true. You know, you do have to migrate. You do have to migrate your hard drives.
They have a system in place where they could keep doing that. I think when you come up, or they hopefully do, but when it comes to an independent filmmaker, I think what gets tricky is, you know, you're off on your next film, and
Absolutely.
you have nobody else keeping track of this stuff. So realistically, how much that's going to happen is what scares me with the
Yeah, realistically, what I tell a lot of artists, and what I've done many panels like this. I've also ActArcs worked with Third World Newsreel, which many of you know, as we did a pro bono collection assessment for them. We went into their New Jersey storage space. We literally built shelves for them, and you know, took things out of boxes. I mean, we walked in, it was like piled to floor to ceiling, and you know, things were crushed. And as you know, if you've ever been to storage spaces, it's not always well organized. And you know, I've done these panels at Manhattan News Network, at you know, Home Movie Day, Home Video Day, Orphans. I mean, this is, we even had a panel at Lincoln Center during New York Film Festival last year about similar topics. This is a topic that's on everybody's mind, and like I said, good enough practices. You need hard drives. You need to back up your hard drives. You need to name your files. That is the baseline of what you need to do. Yes. Don't put them on a shelf and expect them to work in 3-4 years. It is a professional conference filled with archivists and people in the preservation industry, geared towards personal archives, home movies, emails, photos, independent filmmakers, and it's
All of us.
all of us, everybody in this room, anybody with a cell phone. I mean, this is what it's geared toward. Do-it-yourself digital archiving, archive.org. So if you look up personal digital archiving, there's even a conference thing about how to make your own book scanner. So, own book scanner.
I want to turn on my backup drive. Don't throw them away. That's your source material, but capture it, yeah.
Throw them out. Your old drives you can throw out. Yes, I mean, if you have transferred them and you have backed them up and you have verified that the files are correct, look up the word checksum. This is it's basically a digital fingerprint of a file. It goes through the file at a bit level and verifies that the file you have copied onto a new hard drive. And it comes in two essential flavors, MD5 or SHA-1. MD5 is just, checksum is CHECKSUM. Do you use a Mac? If you open up Terminal and say MD5 and then drag a file into it, it will run a checksum automatically. There's also several free programs you can download.
This is the difference between an archivist and a filmmaker. No filmmaker in here is going to do a checksum.
No.
They're just not going to do it.
Yeah, but if
what you
you're
can
really
do,
concerned about that.
which you can do, which I do a lot. I don't mean to interrupt you.
No.
But first of all, those old drives are much smaller than the new drives you're going to buy. The new drives are going to be terabyte sized, 1, 2, 3, 4 terabytes, maybe more. You'll fit all of those old drives maybe on one new drive. That's an advantage. Second thing, what you have to do is go in and check the size, the file size of every folder. And if you really drill down deeper, every folder should do, but make sure when you transfer them, you have to be meticulous about this. You know how in the Mac, you do Command-I, you get information, and it tells you how many bits the file is? Just make sure go through and make sure they match. Make sure they match. I've been doing this since 1984. It works, and I've never lost anything. And I've been migrating everything since then, too. That was when the Mac first came out.
Yeah, I mean, I think I spoke to my online editor this morning at Glue, Steve, and he was saying that the rule of thumb for tape used to be every 10 years you go up. So it's have that, and that's what you should sort of, maybe it'll be 3 or 4 years, maybe it'll be 5 or 7, but like thinking about you have to go to the next level with
There's another thing I should mention, too. A lot of times when your hard drives won't fire up, it's not the hard drive that's bad, it's the power supply. I'd say I can't tell you how many times I've taken a hard drive apart, taken out the bare drive, dropped it into a dock, it works fine. So don't throw out a drive that fails to run, that has something critical on it. Have someone who's technical take the drive out and see if the drive will still run.
Drives that are getting bigger and bigger now, they're still super expensive, that are solid state, there's no moving parts, that might be better for archival purposes as they get bigger.
Too expensive right now, but not only that, there are different types of flash memory that go in those drives, and some flash memory, all flash memory is not equal, and some is, none of it's archival, none of it, but some of it lasts longer and some of it doesn't. And it's a black box. I have a bunch of Samsung SSDs, I use them all the time. You don't want to go there quite yet, unless somebody in the archiving world checks off on it.
Yeah, there's currently, I would not do solid state as a long-term archival solution.
I think we need a resource guide.
There
So
are resource
resource
guides.
guides.
There are resource guides all over. Digitalpreservation.gov. Digitalpreservation.gov is the Library of Congress resource site. You have witness.org has some great resources for filmmakers on how to just basic preservation guidelines, basic ideas for long-term storage.
Indie Collect.
Yeah.
We're looking at making the transfer process more systematic so that you don't go through what you went through. It's called Kineta, like Kinney, Cine, Kinney, TTA.
I should.
All right, well, we're going to take that conversation offline.
I just will say that like the scanners, like Kineta, I mean, this is out of the realm of possibility for most independent film. It's only for an institutional purchase. So if you're thinking of like going home to buy a Kineta to scan your home videos or home movies, don't. Like that. It's not going to happen.
No, that's true, but the whole purpose of Indie Collect obtaining such a scanner is to not do it in a commercial fashion.
Right.
And to make that available to independent filmmakers, such as myself. I have self-interest here, who has 16mm films, 35 films, and can't afford to go to a Duart or whoever's in the business any longer and do the kind of expensive, $400 an hour transfers or whatever that we used to do. There you
How
go.
much have you got? Okay, I'm going to... All right, so let's all storm the Warhol Museum. I'm going to take one more question from Doug Block over there. Before I take that question, I want you to know I did get the thumbs up from Raphael in the back. Vol de Nuit, the Belgian beer bar on West 4th Street. It's just less than a block away. It's right next to the Washington Square Diner there on West 4th on the east side of 6th Avenue.
Down an alley, right?
It's down a little alley. Just follow the crowd there. But they've get the French fries there, which is all the food they have. So Doug Block, last question. Make it a good one.
I'll try. I'm very encouraged when David says that digital files can last forever, can being the operative word. I'm not encouraged when you say we have to migrate it every 4 years and make clones and keep doing that. What about the cloud? What about cloud as the storage? Is it out of
Question was cloud
No.
storage.
No.
anything that you see? What are you saying for migrating an LTO? How many years?
I mean, I would just pay attention. I would just pay attention for the generations, really. At that point, I mean, LTO tape on its own, and also we should say that this is a storage only solution. LTO is not an active, like you're not going to be able to say you can plug in a drive at this point and edit off of a drive. You cannot do that with LTO at all. This is storage only. And I would say that, I can't remember the numbers, but it's definitely way longer than, migration is way longer than a regular hard drive. And it's really, at Democracy Now!, I don't think we actually migrate until there's like a generational issue.
I'm hearing like 10 and 20 years from
Yeah.
some of the LTO guys now. So that may be the answer for lazy makers.
We're out of time for questions, but there'll be a lot more to be said about this topic. This has just been a day and a half summit, 5 panels. There's plenty of other topics that we could have covered. This is the hope for this was to begin a conversation, to bring together people in the room, and I'm sure you're going to leave here with a lot of questions, and I hope you keep asking those questions, and we'll do our best to try to find answers for them. Keep following the International Documentary Association that I think has been very galvanized around this topic. They're beginning a resource page on their website. At DocNYC, this is something that we want to keep paying attention to. I'm sure we're going to revisit it.